We look at something and we say, okay, what's that about? Oh, there's something over here. I got to look at that. Oh, there's something over there. I got to look at that. Yeah, it sounds like you're scrolling on your phone, right? And what's happened to us is that we've become shallow. We don't want to look. Or when we do look, we either get giddy or we get confused, but we walk away too soon. There's a man named Neil Postman, and he was some kind of psychologist, cultural critic. And he wrote a book in the mid-'80s called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And his point was, it was just about television. This was back in the 80s. He said, let's take the Vietnam War for an example. It was the first war where things were fought on the streets of America, in the sense that the tragedy of the war in Vietnam was shown on the evening news. Or the protests at some of the universities in the United States, those tragedies where, say, the 4 students were shot at the University of Ohio, I think it was, those are showed on the nightly news. So somebody like Walter Cronkite or Lloyd Robertson or somebody would say, this is what happened, folks. So many dead, so much damage. And there would be videos of blood, videos of people weeping, videos of mothers crying for their children. And then, when that was just starting to sink in, by the way, the Yankees played the Red Sox this afternoon, and it was a great game, and Carl Yastrzemski hit 3 home runs. So you've gone from the tragedy of life, dealing with it, to all of a sudden a baseball game, or a Pepsodent commercial, or somebody trying to sell you a Chevy. Our focus became different. And it's changed. It's changed how we think. It's changed how we live. There's a word in the Bible, it's behold. You almost got to say it with a behold. It's one of those Bible words that grabs your attention. What it really means is look. Have a look. But behold is it's like have a look, but with an exclamation mark behind it. Remember when Moses was walking through the desert, looking after his father-in-law's sheep, he saw a burning bush. And it says in the text, he went over and behold, the bush was burning, but it wasn't being consumed. Well, it's the kind of thing that makes you want to go over and have a look. Why is this happening? Why do I see fire and I see flames and I know that bush is on fire, but the bush doesn't burn up? Behold, have a look. Now, some of you from farming backgrounds, you had these wonderful things that happened on the farm. There was routine stuff, but yet there were bursts. There were things that were worth stopping, having a look. How can I help? There are miracles happening on the farm all the time. And that is what I would call a behold moment. Somehow today, though, I grew up on a dairy farm most of my growing up life. I think these miracles would have been interrupted by my phone if I was going in that lifestyle. But my point is, what are you looking at? And are the things that are you looking at, are they affecting you? And I think the answer to that, even before we explain anything, everybody would say yes. The things we are looking at do affect us. Some of the things that we look at bring us joy. They bring us joy. When you see your kids getting married, when you see your grandchildren presented to you for the first time. Anybody's had those experiences, you go, that is joy. That is pure joy. Graduations. When you see a change in somebody's life for the better, that brings us joy. But there are some things that scare us. Now, I'm not one of those people who, call them a siren chaser, right? When I hear a siren, I don't go racing out to see what the siren's all about. If it's an accident, that's not the kind of thing that I go running across the road to have a look at. If I'm the only one there and I got to do something, well, that's another story. But I don't go looking to look at those kind of things. I'm not interested. Some things just scare me. And there's other things that I look at that could scar me. But yet, we all need to look. We all need to understand. And I think we need to understand more than we do right now. When we look at Psalm 34, we see this is a psalm that David wrote. Remember the story in, I guess it's probably in 1 Samuel, where David was running from Saul. And he ended up serving King Achash, the Philistine king, for a while. And he got into a pickle because he being associated with King Achash, he had to do some stuff that he just couldn't do as an Israelite. So what he did, he faked that he was mad. He had saliva running through his beard, and he was acting crazy. And finally, King Achash says, "Get this guy out of here. I got enough of my own crazy people here. I don't need some Jewish guy that's crazy. Get him out of here. Just get him out of here." So David got out of a hard pickle and a hard spot at that time. But this was also the time where Saul was chasing him. So he ends up in the cave of Adullam, and he's safe there. It's a safe place for a time. And the scholars say that that's where he wrote this psalm. It starts out with, "I will bless the Lord at all times, and his praise shall be continually on my mouth. My soul will make its boast in the Lord, and the humble will hear it and rejoice. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together." There's a lot of titles you could take from this verse, like, what's in your mouth? Who are you praising? What brings you joy? Who are you going to with joy? Who are you magnifying in your life? All of these things are questions I could ask you. It all matters. I sought the Lord and he answered me, and he delivered me from all my fears. To who are you looking for answers? Who are you trying to get answers from? Is it from God? They looked to him and were radiant, and their faces will never be ashamed. They looked to him. They looked to God, and their faces were radiant. That's why we had some of these Sunday school songs this morning, like, let your light shine. Let your light shine. Spend time with God. You have a light. Show it to the world. Well, when a Christian spends time with God, there's a joy, a joy that radiates from them. You can tell where you've been. Remember Moses up on the mountain when he was receiving the law from the Lord? He came down and his face was glowing, it says. It was glowing to the point where the people couldn't look at it. But it was spending time with the Lord and real fellowship. Like Moses, God said, Moses was my friend. He spent time with the Lord. He came off the mountain and it glowed from his face. And the people said, "You know what? Just tell us what you've got to tell us, but then put a veil over that face because it's too hard to look at. It's too hard for us to look at." Where we've been makes a difference. When I was a kid growing up on the farm, I had days where we were finishing our chores and the bus was there. So you ran from the barn, got on the bus, and everybody on the bus knew where you were because you had that odor of the barn still on you. You couldn't hide it. And those who grow up on farms and live on farms, that that's true. So where you've been, what you've looked at, what you've invested your life into will show on here's an Old Testament word, on your countenance. People will see it on you. So there's examples in the Bible of somebody who made choices, and I want to turn over and we're going to talk a lot. And it's interesting, this morning in Sunday school, we ended up talking about Lot a little bit, and I'm sitting there, I hope they just don't take my sermon away from me. But it didn't go too far. But you remember in the Old Testament, you had Abram. Abram was living with his family in the land of Ur, and God called Abram into this adventure to go to a new land. So Abram, his wife Sarah, Lot, his nephew, and his wife, and Abram's father, and they all leave the land of Ur and they travel to a city called Haran. And they live in Haran until Abram's father dies, and then God says, you come on down to Canaan. So they go into Canaan, and they're living there, and they are doing well. God is blessing them. They're becoming rich. And they've got so much livestock that Abram's livestock managers, his herdsmen, and Lot's managers, herdsmen, they're quarreling with each other because there's not enough land to support the whole bunch of them. So Abram pulls Lot aside and he climbs up on some hill, I imagine, and he says, no, we've got to figure this out. We can't be fighting. We're relatives. We can't be fighting with each other, so we're going to have to separate so that there's enough room for your flocks and my flocks. So Abram says in Genesis 13, you can look out there. So Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right. And if to the right, I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes, and he saw the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. And this was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as you go to Zoar. And Lot chose for himself all the valley of Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. So what did Lot look at? Abram says, have a good look. You got the valley of Jordan, and then you got the other direction. Whichever way you go, whichever you want, I'll go the other way. It's your choice. What are you looking at? So Lot looks, and it's like the garden of the Lord, it says. I mean, this is good ground. If you're going to be a sheep raiser or a sheep, oxen, whatever you're raising, lots of grass, right? That's what you need. You need lots of grass. You got these ruminant animals, and they need grass. So Lot's no dummies. He said, I'll take the grass. I'll take that garden of the Lord. That's where I'm going to go. Well, what else was he looking at, you think? Lot had a wife. He had daughters. What were they all looking at? Well, it says Abraham moved off, and Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked and exceedingly sinners against the Lord. Now you can't tell me that Lot did not know that. Here's a part of the Bible that's always confused me a little bit. In 2 Peter chapter 2, Peter says that righteous man, Lot, was troubled every day from the sin that he saw in Sodom. And when I read the story of Lot, I go, are you sure, Peter, that guy was that righteous? But that's what Peter says. But he didn't shield himself from what he saw in Sodom. He saw the sin and the corruption. He knew God. He knew Abraham. He knew Abraham's relationship with God. Well, maybe that never was as real to Lot as it was for Abraham, but he was associated with all of that. And yet, he chose a good land, and good for him. But he also right away started moving toward those cities. And before you know it, that's where he's ending up. So in the next chapter, chapter 14, there's several kings that attack the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Lot gets caught up in that, and he's taken captive by these kings. So he's moved from the good land, the land that God provides for him. He's moved into the city where he knows there's evil. And the next thing you know, he's swept up in some kind of judgment on these cities. He's swept up in that. But God is gracious. And he sends Abraham. Abraham gets his whole army, herd, whatever he's got there, his fighting people. And he chases after these kings, and he gets all the people back, gets all their possessions back, and he reestablishes them in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Lot's back there in the wicked city. Now, he was looking at all of this. Now, did he say, come on, honey, my daughters, let's get out of here? This was a close call. Let's get out there to where the grass is. Let's get out there where we don't have that temptation in front of us all the time. Let's get out there where our hearts can just praise God. We can look up at the stars and we can see the goodness of God, and we can see what's happening in our herds and how they're growing. Let's get out of this. But he didn't do that. He stayed there. So you guys, you all know the story of what happened. Eventually what happens is that, you have the story of Abraham almost negotiating with God. And I think it was for Lot's family was behind all of this. He said, Lord, can you find just 10 people? Can you find just 10 righteous people there and you don't destroy them cities? And God says, if I could find 10, I won't destroy it. But then Abraham walks away because he knows. He knows where Lot is. And he knows the state of those cities. Abraham was never tempted to look at those. He stayed away from there. Lot was right in the middle of it. So when these angels go into Sodom, they come into the gate. Who's at the gate? Who's an elder in that city? Well, Lot's sitting there. He's fully ingrained now. Now, Peter said he was a righteous man, and I'm going to believe Peter. But he was living a life that was contrary to what God wanted for him. He was exposed his family into that lifestyle. And then when he takes these men into his house for their protection, there's a mob that comes. And it shows you how wicked the people were. They said, bring those people out. We want to have relations with them. These were homosexual relations that they wanted. And Lot says, no. They're under my protection. But tell you what I'll do. I'll give you my daughters. They're virgins. That's how far Lot had sunk. Now you might say, well, hospitality and protection of the stranger was just paramount in those days. But your own daughters? That's when you look at the wrong thing. That's where you end up. That's where you end up. And just incremental steps toward tragedy for your life, for your children. So they say, get out of this city. God's going to judge it. Who do you have here? So, well, there's sons-in-laws. There's men who are engaged to my daughters. Well, go get them. Well, they wouldn't go. They wouldn't believe him. So the angels say, run. Just get out of here. Run. Go to the mountains. Get out of here. Go. Oh, no, I can't go all the way that far. Just let me go over to Zoar, to that city over there. Isn't that far enough? So God's gracious. He says, okay, go that far. Go that far. But don't turn around. Don't look back. Do not look back. That's over for you. It's over for you. God is being gracious to them. He's saying, here, I'm offering you a way out of this. It's like he does for all of us. A way out of the predicament that we're in. The sin that's trapped us. And he says, here's forgiveness. But don't look back. So they run, and they get there. But Lot's wife, she can't give it up. You can't give it up. All the work she's done in her house, all the work she's done just to make it so. Just to, you know what it's like to decorate a house. She couldn't give it up. That was her lifestyle. It was everything. You know, sometimes when I talk to people about Christianity, and it happens often, say if I talk to somebody and they're in a church, say the United Church or some church like that has more or less lost the gospel. And I try to share the gospel with them. Many times, the husband will listen, but the wife will be dragging him away. Dragging him away. And you say, why do you think that is? It's because that's their life. That's where they're comfortable. That's where their friends are. That's what they're looking at. They're looking at, well, if this guy sharing the gospel with me, he's going to disturb my life. I don't want to look at that. I want to look at what I've always been. You know, I have couples that come and they say, well, you know, my son or my daughter, we baptized them when they were babies and they made a profession of faith when they were 15 or 16, but truth is they haven't been inside a church for 25 years. But they're still following the Lord. They're still Christians, they're just backsliding right now. So you try to give them a dose of reality and say, you know, you have to be real about this. Your son or daughter needs the gospel. They need the gospel. They need the gospel. Don't look at something that happened years ago and say that was the defining moment. Look at what's going on now and do the things that God is calling you to do to save their life. Not to keep peace in the home, but to save their life. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Lot's wife turned around and she became a pillar of salt. She was no longer able to repent. And you know, the story of Lot and his daughter seems to go from bad to worse, and we won't go into all of that today. But they were looking at the wrong things. If we look at Hebrews chapter 12, if I can find it, there we go. Hebrews chapter 12, starting at verse 1, it says, therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. You know, the great cloud of witnesses. Some people say, you know, these are people that are watching us and cheering us on. Like they're sitting on the bleachers of heaven looking down. Well, I don't believe that. I think what the Bible is teaching us is that there is a cloud of witnesses. There is a bunch of people that we learn from. People who looked to God. We call chapter 11 the Hall of Fame of Faith. You know, where you see it starts out with Cain and Abel, not Cain, Abel, yes, and Abram and Moses, the patriarchs. It said here, you know, Rahab. Rahab is an interesting one. Rahab the harlot from Jericho, the one who took in the spies that were spying out the land. She had been looking across the desert. She says in her story, just let me paraphrase, but she said, we know what's been going on out there. We know that God's hand has been on you. You know, when 2 million people come across the desert and they fight battles here and there, everybody knows about it. Everybody in Jericho should have been looking at that and understanding there's a God. He was easy to recognize because of the victories that these people were winning. Only Rahab understood with her family. She was looking at the truth. And she was saved because she helped those spies. And the spy says, you make sure that when the moment comes that Jericho is attacked and defeated, that there's a scarlet ribbon hanging out of your window and your family's there with you. If you do that, you will be saved. If you look to what we're saying, if you look to God, you're going to be saved. And that's exactly what happened. Rahab was a wonderful example of this cloud of witnesses who did not despair, but understood that God was there for them. Moses didn't despair. It says Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, all the prophets. These are people who looked to God. Jephthah, I really like Jephthah. He is a man of faith. He said something stupid about, I'm going to sacrifice whatever comes out of my house. But he's still in the Hall of Fame because he was faithful to God. He made a rash statement. And nobody wants to talk about Jephthah. But Jephthah was a great man who made mistakes, just like us. People make mistakes, but they're part of the cloud of witnesses. We can follow the example. We can look to Jephthah. We can look to David. We can look to Rahab. We can look to Abel because they were people of faith. Look to them. Jesus, he looked to what was ahead. He looked at that suffering, but he knew that if he endured that suffering, he would sit down at the right hand of God. You say, well, he was God, it was easy for him. No, it wasn't easy for him. He was humiliated by the people he created. But much more than that. You could say, well, lots of people got crucified, and that's true. Lots of people suffered, but only one was able to suffer for the sins of the whole world. The sins of the whole world put on a God that's holy. Holy! We have no idea what holy is. Try to close your eyes and imagine at some time what holy is. Can you? No darkness, no blemish, just bright, shining light. It's no wonder that Jesus said people want to stay in the darkness because they can't stand to look at holiness. They couldn't even look at Moses' face, let alone the holiness of God. Holiness. In James chapter 1, verse 25, it says, but one who looks intently at the perfect law, the law of liberty, and abides in it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an effectual doer, this man will be blessed in what he does. What are you looking at? James said, look into that perfect law, the law of liberty, the law that sets you free. We all remember the Old Testament law, all the do's and the don'ts. It was given because God wanted to live among his people. So you had to do these sacrifices. You had to wash your clothes. You had to leave the camp, come back at evening when you were clean again. All of those mattered because God was with his people, walking around with the cloud. He was with us, but the people had to be pure. But when Jesus died on the cross, that was all fulfilled. And now we look into that perfect law of liberty, the law of love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your wife, love your husband, love your children. Love them enough to tell them the truth. Look into that perfect law and you will find peace. Peace because Jesus has paid the price for you. We're not in danger of losing our salvation. It's there for us. Look into that perfect law. Live in that peace. Live in that joy. That's how God wants us to live. You know, the hymn we sang, Breathe on Me, Breath of God. I believe it's the third verse. Breathe on me, breath of God, till I am wholly thine, until this earthly part of me glows with thy fire divine. That's possible for all of us. You know, a couple of Mondays a month, I have the opportunity to sing in nursing home with Ron Shutt. Some of you know him. John Ricky's there once, one of those Mondays. Phyllis and Julie participate. And they really don't want us to open the Bible and talk Bible verses there. But what we do is we sing these beautiful songs and we talk about the songs. You know, 30 to 60 seconds. And if we sang this song, I would say to those people, until this earthly part of you glows with thy fire divine. You know, those people are all in wheelchairs. They're all struggling. Some of them have dementia. Some of them don't even remember being there. But we know that God loves them. And when we take the love of God to those people, and they receive it, and they do receive it, don't they? They do. Even the ones that can't sing, when I shake their hand afterward, they pull out another hand and they mouth, thank you, because they felt the love of God and that fire divine.